Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
President Trump says we own the Strait. Welcome to the Wednesday edition as the U.S. and Iran harden positions in what has devolved into a stalemate over the Strait of Hormuz. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Kailey, the president's post today on Truth Social that we own the Strait sort of reminds you of the old Pottery Barn rule. Colin Powell, you break it, you own it.
Yeah, well, or control it, as the president is suggesting.
Right.
He has said this repeatedly over the course of the last few days. He told this to our colleague Josh Wingrove as well, also saying that the Strait already is open, but we know that that is not fully the case. Yes, more barrels per day are getting out, according to the Energy Secretary. 9 million barrels per day was the latest number. But we're still nowhere near the levels we saw pre-war, and we still seem nowhere near a permanent end to this war, a negotiated outcome to this conflict overall.
Getting a little forgiveness in the markets today. Oil prices have actually been slightly lower, but we just don't have much news to go on here. Having opened the week with an expectation of a potential breakthrough here, but we are so far away from negotiations at this point, it's difficult to tell. We'll get an update from Tyler coming up at the White House.
Yeah, we also have to talk about the primary results from the 6 states that went to the polls yesterday. Most notably, perhaps, is in Wisconsin, where the Democratic Socialist Francesca did not come out victorious, as polls widely indicated she would. They were wrong.
Yeah.
She lost, albeit narrowly, to David Crowley, the more moderate Milwaukee County executive.
3,000 votes.
Pretty remarkable.
Barely, yeah, but it really reminds us of how noisy the polling has been from some important states, including Wisconsin and Michigan. We'll talk with Bryan Steil from the great state of Wisconsin, Republican Congressman, and we'll get his take on some of the results from last night.
Yeah, looking forward to that conversation. But first, we begin, as always, with a look at the markets. And for that, we turn to Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe and Kailey. Right now, we're looking at gains for the U.S. equity market, close to a record on the S&P. The current level is 77.52. The old closing high last week, 77.57 on the S&P. So just about 5 points away right now, looking at a gain of 0.3%. S&P up by 24. Dow higher by 23, up under 0.1%, while NASDAQ is up 175 points. For the NASDAQ Composite Index, that is a gain of 0.7%. The SOX is ripping higher. That's the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index, up 3.3%. The VIX below 15 now. The 2-year CPI Wednesday. See the 2-year 4.18%, with the 10-year 4.66%, and the 30-year 5.23%. Gold, meanwhile, 44.04 the ounce, up 0.8%. We are looking at crude oil falling as traders, investors keep an eye on developments out of the Middle East. WTI 82.88 a barrel, down 0.4%. Brent right now 88.53 barrel of Brent crude, down by about 0.5%. Lots of earnings to sift through. CoreWeave, a provider of computing that powers AI systems, is surging. CoreWeave is up now by 19.3%. Also out with earnings yesterday was Supermicro Computer. That stock jumping as well today. Supermicro, SMCI on the ticker, up now by 16%. After the close of trading today, we'll be hearing from Cisco Systems ahead of earnings. We do have Cisco Systems up by 1.8%. Major deal, record-breaking deal in the sports world. Josh Kushner and Bob Iger buying the LA Lakers basketball team for a record-breaking price of more than $12 billion. Keeping an eye on shares of Madison Square Garden, they're up by 4.6%. MSG is the owner of the Knicks. In the meantime, Mark Walters' firm TWG Global in talks with investors to raise money to help pay down loans on the books of its insurers that have drawn scrutiny from the Justice Department. Again, recapping here, stocks are moving higher. S&P right now up by about 0.3%. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet with the latest on the markets. Thank you very much. I'll bring you the latest now from President Trump's Truth Social feed. As we alluded to, he once again is saying that the United States is controlling the Strait of Hormuz. He says, in fact, and this is a quote, "The U.S. has total control over the Strait of Hormuz. I think we will keep it." This part is written in all caps. I think we will keep it. He says, "Our naval blockade is being called by everyone a wall of steel, and there is nothing Iran can do about it." Of course, this isn't the first time in recent days that we have heard the president echo these claims around total control of the Strait. We also heard it yesterday as he was landing at Joint Base Andrews, where he also was touting not just what's happening with Iran, but also what we're seeing in the stock market.
The country's doing well. The stock market's fantastic record. We have 79 records so far in a short period of time. More people are working right now in the United States than ever before, and prices are dropping fast. Iran is going fine, going just absolutely fine. We totally control the Strait of Hormuz. We have control over it. Nobody else, only us. Our Navy is unbelievable.
Adding, we own it with regard to the Strait, and that Iran's actions will be met with force. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall is at the White House right now to bring us up to date on things. Tyler, it does seem like we are far beyond negotiations right now. Is the president accurate that we have total control over the Strait?
Well, Joe, at this point, it's very evident that both sides are trying to dig into their positions when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, but there's very little sign that Iran is going to give up the leverage it has when it comes to the waterway, not just in terms of its grip on shipping in Hormuz, but also, importantly, we should point out the other disruptions to global shipping, as earlier today, Yemen's government confirmed that at least 6 people died in a Houthi attack in the Red Sea, marking the first such fatalities of a Houthi attack since this specific conflict has started. President Trump touting the U.S.'s naval blockade, which just yesterday we saw in full effect as the U.S. military targeted a Panama-linked vessel that appeared to try to get through toward an Iranian port. We're getting different sorts of information. The U.S. Energy Secretary, as we spoke about yesterday, saying that about 9 million barrels per average are moving through the Strait per day over the last week. That is, though, higher than most traders' estimates. A few different things that we have to watch here, including the risk for escalation, as now Iran is demanding that as part of any deal to reopen the Strait, there needs to be compensation for war damages, keeping in mind that was a precondition when we were talking about talks about potential curbs on Iran's nuclear program, not to ensure the safe passage of vessels.
Well, of course, whether or not the passage of vessels can be guaranteed and energy can keep flowing does have implications for costs here at home. We did see that cooler CPI today as energy costs come down, but there is still a major question of whether or not more inflation pressure and relief when it comes to prices will be coming for the American consumer and voter ahead of the midterms November. And our latest reporting indicates that the president may be looking for other ways to find consumers relief, including looking at potentially some tax relief. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Kailey, this came last night after his NEC director, Kevin Hassett, was in conversation with Fox Business's Larry Kudlow, who, of course, had worked for the first Trump administration. And it was Kudlow who had suggested that he's spoken directly with President Trump about some potential ideas that perhaps Congress could get through, but likely only after the midterms. And that's, depending on what ultimately happens with those elections. That includes potentially indexing capital gains, meaning taxes would be applied on gains adjusted for inflation, as well as exemptions for sales of homes worth $2 million or less from capital gains taxes. This administration, as you mentioned, has previewed that they're going to start to roll out some additional measures that perhaps they can entice the American public with as they do play defense on the economy. Kailey, I'd point you to a new Fox News poll out last month that shows for the first time since 2010, Democrats are leading Republicans when it comes to voter confidence on handling the economy. This is an issue historically that the GOP has pulled better on, but according to their July polling, Democrats are leading Republicans on this issue by 9 percentage points. We did see President Trump take action earlier this week as Bloomberg News confirmed that he extended that Jones Act waiver by 90 days, which, as you both know, is a bid to make it cheaper to transport some of these critical goods like energy supplies like diesel, jet fuel, and gas across the United States.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so much. And on this notion of calling on Congress for capital gains tax relief and on other issues, including the results of the primary in his state of Wisconsin yesterday, I'm pleased to say that joining us now is Republican Congressman Bryan Steil of Wisconsin's 1st District. He's also chair of the House Administration Committee. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's always good to have you, sir. And we do want to talk about what happened in your state last night and what it means for what will happen in Wisconsin moving forward. But just quickly, this idea of capital gains tax relief, do you think that's something that actually could be delivered on by you and your colleagues, if not ahead of the midterms, perhaps in the lame duck session?
Well, I think there's a lot of focus in making sure that we're reducing the tax burden on hardworking families. There's been a lot of conversation for a long time about indexing capital gains to inflation. We saw a massive run-up inflation, in particular on the backside of the pandemic. So a lot of people who saved up for life events, whether or not that's retirement, a child's education, a wedding in your family, are being hit by capital gains on the backside of that. And so part of the broader package of making sure we're providing relief to hardworking families, I think, is to look at indexing capital gains in that regard. Whether or not that can get done before the election, I'm not sure. But it is something that should be part of the broader conversation, because a lot of hardworking families that are making savings inside the markets shouldn't be punished for the fact that inflation ran rampant, in particular as we came out of the pandemic.
Looks like you have a lot of room there for family on Thanksgiving, Mr. Chairman. I need to ask you about some of the results of the contest last evening here. You were at the Tom Tiffany party, I understand. Were you disappointed when the race was called for David Crowley? I'm making the Thanksgiving reference because, of course, Francesca Hong had to recant her idea of canceling the holiday, and it did not help her last night. While she came close, she did not win, and I know a lot of Republicans were hoping she would.
Well, in many ways, Wisconsin elections are almost always close, in this case, in the Democratic primary. But I think what Wisconsin voters will see in the near future is actually that David Crowley and Francesca Hong are in many ways two sides of the same coin. As the lights became brighter, and people started to understand what Francesca Hong stands for, she became less popular. I think now people are going to focus in on David Crowley and actually recognize that they share many of the same policy goals. David Crowley raised taxes as he was county executive, in particular on the sales tax. You had Francesca Hong, who wanted to make Wisconsin the highest taxed state in the country. You have a series of mismanagement in Milwaukee County by David Crowley. We can't allow that type of mismanagement in Washington. And so he opened up his speech today by saying, "Let me introduce myself." That tells you Wisconsin voters don't really know who David Crowley is. Many of them, I think, voted against Francesca Hong and rejected the radical socialist policies that actually David Crowley supports himself. And so I feel good that at the end of this election, 83 days, Tom Tiffany will be elected governor of the state of Wisconsin. I think voters writ large are done with the radical policies of the left, are looking for common sense reforms. And I think that's what Tom Tiffany will bring to our state.
Well, Tom Tiffany, by one metric, has been called the most conservative congressman in the Wisconsin delegation. He also denied the results of the 2020 election. Is that not radical?
I think what people are going to look at in particular is kitchen table issues, or Thanksgiving table issues, if you will, and look at the record of bringing down costs. We're going to look at what Tom Tiffany and I supported about reducing taxes, for example, on overtime, on Social Security, making life more affordable. Our work to unleash American energy, all the more important during this time of international turbulence. And so there's going to be a lot of back and forth. Wisconsin campaigns are always heated, always competitive. This will be a close race. But I think as people learn more about David Crowley, they'll recognize that his positions are extreme and that Tom Tiffany is bringing common sense reforms to our state that are needed at a period of time where families are struggling to make ends meet.
Well, it is not lost on us that Tiffany would be the first person who voted to overturn the 2020 election in Congress to become governor of a state like Wisconsin. Congressman, have you chosen to look through that for the sake of his other policy positions, or does it just not matter anymore?
Well, I think there's opportunities here to enhance our election integrity. I think, broadly speaking, the country recognizes and knows that. That's why I've been a forefront leader in making sure that we are verifying citizenship and that we're also using photo ID. And so I think what voters want to see is what policies are moving us forward. I don't think there's going to be a massive look back into 2020. I think voters want to know, what are you doing for us today to bring costs down and make life more affordable? And the contrast between Tom Tiffany and Republicans against the radical Democrats and David Crowley could not be more stark in the state of Wisconsin.
Well, Congressman, I'd like to ask you as well about the business that will be before you and your colleagues when you return from recess, or what may not be before you, which is a Senate-passed version of the Clarity Act, which obviously you and your colleagues already got through the House some time ago. The Senate did not take any action on that before they broke for 5 weeks. And I wonder if you expect that this digital asset market structure bill actually is going to be able to find life post-recess before the midterms, or whether it can in the lame duck once the elections are over, if this is just an effort that's going to be put to bed until the next Congress comes around.
The currency of the Senate is floor time. And so I thought it was actually a really positive move that Senate Majority Leader Thune has called that the clarity, market structure legislation, and digital assets will have time on the floor. This is the chance for the Senate to address the bill head on. It's so important that this legislation passes. The U.S. needs to remain the world leader in the financial markets, in particular in the digital asset space. The United States has been the innovator in financial services for now over 100 years, and our economy across the board has benefited from this. Consumers deserve to have protection in this space. We need to make sure innovation is happening in the United States, that we're outcompeting countries like China. And it's a positive move that the Senate is bringing this up for floor time. Floor time is the limited currency in the Senate. Putting the focus on this into the home stretch before we hit the election, I think, is a really big win. I'm optimistic the Senate gets this done and the House is able to pass the Senate version that comes out.
Interesting. How about your stock trading ban? Mr. Chairman, that's what we were talking about. I think last time you were on Bloomberg, and there were big congrats for you when it passed the House. The Senate pushed this to the side for now, at least. Are you disappointed, and do you have any assurances that they'll take this up as well?
Well, it was really positive. The House passed my bill to stop Insider Trading Act to prevent members of Congress from being even in the position to benefit off of any inside information they may gain while serving in Congress. The Republicans in the Senate brought this up for unanimous consent. This should be a no-brainer piece of legislation. I was frustrated when Democrats objected to passing that legislation outright. Again, time in the Senate is all driven by floor time. And so I'm hopeful that this bill makes it to the floor, that it is considered, and that it passes. These are the types of common sense reforms I think the American people deserve. I was proud to see it pass the House, but the job is not done until we get it across the line in the Senate.
Finally, Mr. Chairman, given your chairmanship of the Administration Committee, you also see issues like security, not just for members, but pertaining to the Secret Service as well. And I wonder what your reaction was to the Washington Post reporting in the last 24, 48 hours or so about the president getting off of Air Force One, the old Air Force One, onto a catering truck and alternate aircraft to leave Turkey after the NATO summit, leaving Air Force One and the many press and administration officials on it as decoys. Do you find that maneuver is appropriate? Do we not need to know where the president is? What if one of those aircraft had gone down?
Well, I think it's important that elected leaders are following the advice of security professionals. In this case, the President of the United States appears to have been following the suggestion and advice of the Secret Service based on a credible threat. Of course, Turkey shares a border with Iran, roughly 200 miles of border. There was apparently information provided by our Israeli allies that there was a direct threat on the President of the United States. The President of the United States, I think correctly, is relying on his security advisors to make sure that he's protecting him. We want to make sure the Commander-in-Chief is safe and secure. The positive news is that this plot, to the extent that it existed, did not materialize. That's a good thing. But often our elected leaders are left to rely on security professionals. And here, the Secret Service was doing their job to keep the Commander-in-Chief safe.
Yeah, pushing them into a catering truck, Congressman. It's great to see you. Thank you for coming on. As always, Bryan Steil, the Republican from Wisconsin's 1st District, chairs the House Admin Committee. We'll assemble our political panel next. More results to pick through from an important night on the primary trail. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. The Dow higher, barely up now by 1 point, little changed at 53,792. S&P at 7750, the record 7757 right now. S&P higher by 23. That is a gain of 0.3%. NASDAQ Composite up 170. higher by 0.6%. Nasdaq 100 up by 0.9%. All of this with the stocks. The Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index up now by 3.2%. The VIX holding below 15. 2-year on a CPI Wednesday, 4.18%. The 10-year, 4.66%. Your 30-year, 5.23%. We did see an inline inflation reading this morning. That is spurring the gains in stocks and bonds. It's also easing concern about an imminent Federal Reserve rate hike. Right now, spot gold is at $44.08 the ounce, up 0.9%. A retreat for West Texas Intermediate crude, but holding just above $83 a barrel now. WTI down 0.2%. Barrel of Brent, 88.52, lower now by 0.4%. Investors are gobbling up shares of restaurant chains after earnings. The Mediterranean chain Cava Group sales rose faster than expected. Cava right now up by 14.4%. And Brinker International higher after earnings. It owns the Chili's grill and bar chain, among other names. Ticker EAT right now. Brinker International up by 10.8%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much for that check on the markets. I wanted to check on prediction markets as well as we work our way through the aftermath of yesterday's primaries, because of course there's a lot of political bets that take place on forums like Kalshi and Polymarket these days, and they got a lot wrong yesterday, it seems, specifically in the Wisconsin gubernatorial race. As of 11 p.m. on August 10th, the day before the primary, Francesca Hong had 95.5% odds on Kalshi of winning that nomination. David Crowley only had 4.6. David Crowley, of course, won.
You wagering over there? You would have made
I don't
a lot
place
of money
bets
on that.
myself on politics or anything else, but someone lost a lot of money, and I guess anyone who was in that 4.6% camp probably came away with
no
a pretty
doubt.
good
So
return.
it's not just the pollsters, is what you're saying.
No,
prediction markets.
money follows it too.
We're pretty far off. Amazing, by the way, that not only she lost, but by only 3,000 votes.
A couple tenths of a percent.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about from these contests last evening, and it's kind of hard to draw trends because there were progressives who had a great night. Maybe it was an anti-incumbency kind of evening that we could draw that trend. But let's get into it with our panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor Rick Davis is with us, our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital, alongside Laura Fink, a founder, CEO, Rebelle Communications, Democratic strategist. Rick, what is your thought on another busy primary night? We'd like to tick through some of the states here and the races more specifically, and I want your take on South Carolina as well, which is going to resolve into a runoff. Were there any trends that you could pick up off the board other than the pollsters having a bad night?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't think the pollsters had that bad a night. I mean, one of the things that was very obvious, in that Wisconsin race was that that Hahn had a very high floor. Polling had her at like 45%, but she had a very low ceiling. I mean, in other words, pollsters had a hard time finding other voters who were left to make up their mind who wanted to have her as the nominee. And Crowley had a very low floor, right? I mean, like in the 30s. And yet he had very high ceiling. In other words, there were a lot of voters who hadn't decided or either would choose ultimately to vote for him. And so what do you want? You want a high ceiling. You don't want a high floor. And that's exactly how the thing was determined. It was a close race, but he was able to grow when Hahn was not. And so that's what the polling told us. Now, it's not a predictive model. It's a snapshot in time. I can't speak to predictive models. I think the trends, older incumbents, I mean, as you pointed out a couple of times, 7 have already lost their elections in the Democratic Party. I mean, that's a lot of incumbency turnover in a pro-Democratic year. And so in with the old, or out with the old, in with the new seems to be part of the theme of this thing. And I would say, too, Trump still is having a lot of control over the outcome of the Republican primary. I mean, obviously, his support for South Carolina, Darlene Graham, put her into the lead spot. Still got a task of beating Ralph Norman in a couple weeks. but you wouldn't bet against Donald Trump in this cycle,
unless you were betting on the My Pillow guy. Because Mike Lindell did not win the gubernatorial Republican race in the state of Minnesota. I'll leave that one on the side. If we could just talk about Francesca Hong for a minute longer, Laura, as Rick talked about how she had a low ceiling, I wonder if you think that the outcome of this, which again was only a few tenths of 1%, might have been different if she had actually won the backing of some of the kingmakers of the left. If Bernie Sanders or AOC had come out for her as they did Abdul El-Sayed, would that have changed this outcome?
You know, I think she got every vote from that side of the party. And I think she also did a tremendous job organizing voters in far-flung areas in the rural counties. And I think that showed in her total. I think I agree with Rick that there is a ceiling on support. And I think that voters in Milwaukee County had a choice. They had a guy who was their county executive who they knew and who looked like he could win. And she failed to penetrate that vote. I think in particular that urban Milwaukee vote in a way, the sort of, and I wouldn't even call them moderate voters. I would say sort of the kind of people outside of that strong progressive wing of the party. And we know that the progressive wing drives party turnout, et cetera, but there is a large block of voters that she did not really penetrate. But I think she ran a campaign that you could follow the playbook of, in that she was organizing, she was an underdog, she was underfunded, and she managed to almost eke out a victory. So a lot to be learned here from a real solid effort by Francesca Hong.
Well, okay, so what did Peggy Flanagan do right then to get those important endorsements from the likes of Bernie Sanders? Lieutenant Governor here won by some 20 points in Minnesota, beating Congresswoman Angie Craig. What's the difference in the playbook? You've got an anti-establishment platform, universal health care. Was it the lack of the social media posts or some of the more wild things that Hong said?
I mean, electability is definitely an argument, and AOC and Bernie want to see victories across the board, not just in primaries, but also in general. So I would imagine they're responsive to that. But Peggy Flanagan is just an entirely different case. She is establishment in the sense that she is the lieutenant governor, and where she won her race was really drilling down on the crisis that was ICE in Minnesota. And so by making sure that Angie Craig was seen as on the wrong side of history there, she really galvanized Minnesotans who were, when I talked to my friends from Minnesota, who were deeply, deeply damaged by the work of ICE and by the prospect of government intervening in their communities in the way that it did. And I think Peggy Flanagan was able to capitalize on that and really make it unwinnable for Angie Craig.
Well, Rick, as we consider what is not going to be winnable, let's talk a little bit more about the runoff that's now going to take place in South Carolina in 2 weeks. You alluded earlier how Trump is backing Senator Darlene Graham, as he thinks it's the best way to honor her late brother. She only beat out Ralph Norman, who also is advancing to the runoff by 8 percentage points. Ultimately, Ralph Norman, of course, also has the backing of Nikki Haley, the former governor of the state. And I wonder how you think the Trump pushing for one candidate, Haley pushing for another, might ultimately shake out less than 2 weeks from now.
Yeah. Could I just say, too, Peggy Flanagan maybe had the best tagline of the entire campaign so far: the many versus the money. I mean, I could go all day. Pretty good. But South Carolina, look, I mean, it's a rock rib Republican state. Ralph Norman supported Nikki Haley over Donald Trump. That started a lot of his problems with the president during the primary in 2024. And so it's not a surprise that she would be out campaigning for him. And he'll do well in the Low Country as a result of that, because she's still wildly popular. Lindsey Graham, he was from the center of the state in the Hill Country, and that's where the conservative base of the state is. And likely that turns out strong for his sister. And behind that, the president's organization and money. So look, it's always a mystery to me how Republicans vote in South Carolina. I've won some and I've lost some, and I've never been right. And so the reality of it is it could be a close race, but I really can't imagine a scenario in South Carolina where the party doesn't turn to Trump and therefore support Darlene.
Rick Davis had some wild times in South Carolina with John McCain. Google it. Yeah, Laura, go ahead.
I was just going to add one thing. There's also what I would call the widow effect here, and we know that Darlene is a sister and not a wife, but the empathy for Senator Graham is really in play here. Widows, daughters, relatives of elected officials who pass in office often have that advantage, and particularly in the truncated campaign, in addition to the Trump endorsement, is very powerful. I'd be surprised if she lost.
So let's talk about anti-incumbency. Read the names: Green, Johnson, Goldman, Espaillat, DeGette, Thanedar. Seventh now becomes Larson. Rick Davis, 78 years old, in office since 1999, loses the seat last evening to a 47-year-old former mayor of Hartford. And again, it wasn't close. 22-point spread. What's the message?
You know, look, I think that voters in general are getting worn out on sort of geriatric politics of our country. I mean, we've seen it in leadership in the House and Senate, in the presidency, and it's been happening for a long time. This is not a new issue. And it used to be that you got credit for time in office, you know, for being a senior member of the leadership, for being a committee chairman. And those days are gone. I've not seen a single poll that actually says, hey, great stuff for our state. You're doing a great job for us. You know, stay in as long as you possibly can because your seniority is what really matters to us. And that has turned its head upside down. And so anybody who's been in office for, in the House, you know, 6, 7 terms, or in the Senate, the equivalent of that these days, I think is a target. And we're seeing it in the primaries, and I think you'll see it in the general election.
Well, most of those names that Joe just ran through, Laura, were Democrats. Why is this mostly happening on that side of the aisle?
Well, let's start with the fact that Joe Biden's age was such a significant drag on the party. And really, a lot of people blame his age and his unwillingness to stand down for our loss in 2024. And I think the idea that having a continued generation of politics where we respect people for their level of power while watching Congress get absolutely nothing done, particularly the younger wing of the party is wildly dissatisfied with that, because so many of them have seen that they've only grown up with a politics of gridlock. And so the fact that individual Congress members can't make the case that they're bringing home the bacon to the district is a real drag.
All right, Laura Fink and Rick Davis, our political panel, thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. Tame CPI report this morning. Stocks and bonds are rising. Right now, we have got the S&P advancing to 77.51, higher by 23 points, up 0.3%. Potential record there, 77.57. Right now, the 77.52 on the S&P. The Dow up 33 now, up under 0.1%. NASDAQ is up 0.6%. The NASDAQ 100 index up by 1%. This is CoreWeave soars 19.3%, and shares of Super Microcomputer are up by 17.7%. Right now, the 10-year currently yielding 4.62%, the 2-year 4.18%, and the 30-year 5.23%. Gold is at $44.03 the ounce, up $33, up by about 0.8%. A retreat for crude, down 0.1%. WTI 83.15 a barrel. As for Brent, 88.86, the global benchmark down by 0.1%. Goldman Sachs will pay as much as $2.25 billion to buy Neos Investments, expanding its asset manager's reach in the actively managed ETF market. Goldman Sachs shares, they're gaining now by about 0.3%. And Blackstone and a group of Canadian pension funds are buying a 25% stake in Air Canada's Aeroplan loyalty program for $1.8 billion. Shares of Blackstone down now by 1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. I'm Charlie Pellet, and Kailey and Joe, that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, many thanks. Charlie will be back coming up at the top of the hour, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, as we kick off Bloomberg Business Week Daily with more on the Wednesday trade here. Of course, we're keying off CPI. That's been a big factor in the decisions being made on Wall Street and here in Washington. Although, strangely, Kailey, we haven't seen a statement from the White House or a post on Truth celebrating what was the lowest pace for inflation since March of 2021.
Yeah, the day is still relatively young,
I suppose.
So keep an eye on the True Social feed. But yeah, there's no declarations of victory over inflation at this point yet. And it makes you wonder as well what the Fed is thinking, as we're not hearing directly from Fed policymakers on this today either, ahead of their meeting mid-next month. We're just a few weeks away, that they may or may not feel pressured to hike at, given today's relatively tame print, as Charlie characterized it. But let's get more insight and analysis now as we turn to Christopher Smart for more. He's Arbroath Group founder and managing partner, former special assistant to the president at the National Economic Council during the Obama administration, former Treasury official as well. Christopher, welcome back to Balance of Power. How would you characterize the inflation report today, and how do you expect the Fed is reading it?
I think there really wasn't much news in it, unfortunately, because I think it was more or less in line with expectations, both at the core level and at the headline level. I think, on the one hand, everybody is sort of watching what's going on in the Gulf and whether that might give some relief to energy prices. On the other hand, they are seeing core numbers slowing down ever so gradually. But I think we're still stuck with the same structural problem that we've had going back 5 years, which is that the Fed's preferred gauge on inflation is still not meeting its target of 2%. And I think it was Christopher Waller who said recently, we can't now expect it just to go away by looking at it. We may have to do something here. And I think that's going to sharpen the debate, regardless of today's data, when they convene again, I guess first in Jackson Hole, but really at their September meeting.
You do get a sense, Christopher, and it's great to see you, of exhaustion. You look at the bond market. I mean, yields are barely moving on this. Stocks are kind of floundering, and we've had a big move when you look at what happened in the markets last week. Are we in a world where a single indicator like this is unlikely to move the markets?
It's a weird time. I mean, I don't mean to use technical economic jargon with you, but it's a weird time.
No, same.
I think we're seeing a jobs market, if you just look at the numbers, right? We're growing at 2%. We've got 3% inflation. We've got 4% unemployment. We should all go home and feel good about the world. But I think we're all looking through these numbers to seeing maybe some weakness on the growth side, some very unevenness in the sources of growth, a lot of it going into AI and corporate spending, weakening job market, weakening consumer spending. And then on top of it all is the geopolitics and some sense that I think, that we all have when you talk about being exhausted by it all, is this conflict in the Gulf that continues on and on and on. And frankly, even if there is a deal that is struck, it's not going away. The uncertainty is not going to go away. And I think increasingly markets are starting to look through, we're going to be living with this uncertain supply of oil, gas, aluminum, other key commodities for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is actually something we spoke about with Wendy Sherman, the former architect, the chief architect on the U.S. side of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. She didn't suggest just a long time that this may be the status quo in the Strait of Hormuz. She actually went as far, Christopher, as to say this could last forever. Listen.
I think unless the United States is ready to either allow Iran and perhaps Oman to have voluntary tolls, or to give Iran so much relief from sanctions and frozen assets that it's worth their while, I don't think we'll get it open for any sustainable period of time. And I think the reality is, for the foreseeable future, if not forever, Iran will control the Strait of Hormuz.
Is this market right now positioned for that forever scenario, Christopher?
Well, as you know, forever is a long time. But I think it's not positioned. I think it is looking very much for some news of some kind of a deal and some ships starting to sail both out of the Gulf and into the Gulf. And I think Wendy, who has more experience negotiating with Iran than I think most people in the State Department or elsewhere in Washington, understands that not only is Iran now holding on to this new leverage on the Gulf, but we haven't even begun to talk about the other issues underlying this conflict, whether it is the proxy militias that Iran continues to support, or indeed the nuclear path of its program. So I think there are a lot of questions on the table, and we are realizing increasingly that we have very few levers to solve these problems.
Yeah. I want to point you to the Beige Book, which I read in my free time, Christopher, smart as I know you do, in the 1st District, which is where you are in Boston, and that includes the Northeast here. Community Perspectives. This is really something to read. Usually people tick through consumer spending, they look at manufacturing and see what some of the contacts are saying. All the way at the bottom, Community Perspectives, contacts serving low and moderate income households report increased demand for assistance along several dimensions as families struggle with persistently high prices of food, housing, and transportation. Reliance on food pantries, Christopher, is up. Nonprofits are getting more requests for help with housing payments, healthcare supplies, and lower income consumers are adding credit card debt to pay for essential goods. This is the definition of the K-shaped economy. What does it mean for the political dynamic going into these midterm elections?
Well, I was reading my Beige Book at the beach last week, and unfortunately a shark
Good job.
grabbed that out of my hands before I got to that section.
Hate it when that
But
happens.
I think what you're highlighting is a problem we've been seeing in the macro data for the past couple of years, as both household balance sheets at the lower quintiles of households have been building up. Wage gains have been increasingly eroded by inflation. And then you just sort of see it, I think, when you go to some large cities, the number of homeless people, you hear more stories about people being evicted from their homes. And as you point out, or as the Beige Book points out, the increasing draw on food banks, charitable institutions, and the like. I think it's one of those things where we, for a long, long time, have not had a very robust safety net when things start to weaken. The problem in many ways is that we are living in an economy that may be overheating on the other side with this massive investment, with these stock market gains. And so if you're the Fed and you're trying to adjust, it's a really hard balance to strike. And that's where you really need fiscal policy to step in and say, maybe we're going to tax a little bit more here where things are overheating, and inject money over there where they're starting to weaken.
Overheating, you say, Christopher. You're in the camp that we may be overdoing it on all of this investment?
I just don't know. Hundreds of billions of dollars for data centers just feels in my bones like, shouldn't we slow down a little bit? And well,
does it feel in your bones like I've been through this before, .com-y?
Well, yeah, or and I wasn't around for the great railway boom, but it's one of those things where everybody is racing to build out more capacity. At some point, we'll need it, but making sure that the revenue lines and any hint of a profit, a wisp of a breath of something that looks like profit, looks like it's increasingly being pushed off into the future. So I do worry about that.
Well, it's interesting
and I
to
should
the
say,
extent.
and I'm sorry to interrupt. I should say,
Yeah.
I think the other piece of this is that AI has now become such a central portion, a central pillar of national security policy, that no government in Washington, whether it's a Republican or Democratic one, is going to allow the train to slow down anytime soon. And in fact, if there's going to be any kind of hiccup along the way, we're probably going to get government money coming in at some point or other.
Well, maybe you just answered my question, because it is interesting the extent to which the administration and at least Republican politicians are pushing the AI race and kind of holding off the idea of regulating this very quickly developing technology. And I know that there are political dynamics here to the extent a lot of Democratic lawmakers see it very differently. Bernie Sanders is calling for a pause in AI development. You've seen a mixed sort of political dynamic when it comes to data centers. But do you think that this AI spend outlives this administration, particularly if there's a Democrat in the White House?
Oh, absolutely. I think it will. I think it will. Even with this pushback, and I think people don't like the electricity prices, they don't like data centers, but they kind of like AI, and the economic gains from it, I think, are going to be irresistible. I mean, there are a lot of things in this world I'd love to pause also, but I think it's just unrealistic to expect that to happen, even within the U.S. What I think is also interesting is the dichotomy between how we are approaching things here in America, which is we need to build the biggest, best, fastest model possible and approach whatever that artificial general intelligence line is called. Whereas in China, it's a much more, how do we get these tools that are pretty good, even if they're not the best, out into the economy so that manufacturing, education, healthcare, transportation, they become immediately useful, even if they're not, at their finished stages yet. So I think that's a very interesting difference between how two countries are approaching this so-called race and how we're really never going to declare a winner. It's really a question of how these tools, as they develop, become incorporated into people's lives, companies, business models, and investment returns.
Well, let's talk about how two countries are throwing money at something else, which is the United States and Japan throwing a lot of money at trying to shore up the yen. Obviously, Christopher, we're not too far off what was the first joint intervention we'd seen in decades, and yet the effects seem like they were short-lived. Dollar yen climbing back toward that 160 level. Are they going to have to intervene again? Was this ineffective, ultimately?
My goodness, haven't we learned some lessons over the past almost every single intervention in currency markets, that if the fundamentals aren't there, if the interest rate differentials remain, you can intervene for a couple of days and it feels good. And my goodness, if somebody should know this, it should be Scott Bessent. And so I think what we have accomplished, or what he has accomplished, is to flush out a lot of the shorts who had been driving the yen lower. But as you point out, the exchange rate is sort of back to where it is. And there has been very little progress in narrowing the differential between U.S. rates and Japanese rates. So you would expect those shorts to start picking up the pieces where they left off. And I just don't know what the next step is if you're the Treasury Secretary. And then this, of course, leads to the risk that, others have pointed out, which is that the real reason we're intervening with Japan is not because the president likes the prime minister or Japan is a great ally, but it's because Japan is the largest investor in U.S. Treasuries. And if there is a sell-off of U.S. Treasuries in Japan, that makes America's interest rate costs that much higher. Just all of those kinds of nefarious things that higher interest rates do to the U.S. So I think that's the Treasury Secretary's near-term gain, but I don't know what his next step is now that he has sort of fired this first bullet without a lot of return.
It's always a pleasure to cover the waterfront with Christopher Smart, Arbroath Group, beige book in hand. It's great to see you,
Christopher.
Christopher.
Got it, remember?
Absolutely right. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg.